so, those are all important parts of the history. What's the impact? 2016 median family wealth in the United States, and this comes from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances. I find this to be the most really shocking and disheartening statistic. We hear about disparities in health, disparities in income, disparities in employment levels, but family wealth, white median household wealth is $171,000 in the United States. Hispanics $20,700, and African American is $17,600. So 10 times higher. Big part of that's housing. Discrepancies in home ownership in the United States: African American 41%, white 71%. That's a 30-point gap. The gap when the war on poverty began was 30%. So we have not budged. It actually did contract, but it's expanded back out again. In Charlottesville, we have lower home ownership rates across the board, which isn't surprising, but African American 30%, white 47%. So these are all important statistics to keep in mind, should be informing the goals and policies that our local governments are coming up with in their plans. So that's, I would say kind of the real negative, I think, the bad intent in our history and the legacy of it. There's also things that are market forces at play here, and that are very complex and kind of hard to understand and hard to wrestle with. But that's also shaping what we're seeing in the gentrification that people here are discussing today. Also pulled a few other statistics. There was an Urban Land Institute survey in 2015. 60% of millennials want to live in a place where they can use their car less. And so I think one of the big problems we have is there's been an explosion in interest in living in places where you don't need a car, living in cities. And yet we have a limited supply of those places. And so that's, limited supply, increased demand, naturally pushing up the prices. Homeownership rates come into play as well because renters are more vulnerable than property owners. And also, planning. We almost every planner out there would tell you growing inward's better than growing outward, largely for sustainability, environmental sustainability reasons. And yet that comes with the unintended consequences it can of pushing people out, displacement, gentrification. So I think there's a lot of, proposal. When we're talking about proposal, what do we do about this? There's a lot of different solutions. I don't want to repeat too much of what they said. I agree with all of it. I'm especially interested in kind of community ownership. You may want to write down, and I actually did this case study for EPA about 4 years ago. I don't know how it's doing today. If it's a total flop, I'm sorry I even brought it up. But Market Creek Plaza in San Diego. This was a retail center that was developed by basically by the community. It's a community-owned retail center. A lot of the profits go back to the residents of the neighborhood who are investors. There's 419 local investors. There's also a community foundation that's neighborhood controlled that's an investor, so profits from this go back into the neighborhood foundation, back to the local citizens, most of whom are minority. Crowdfunding could also be a strategy. It used to be to invest in real estate, you had to be an accredited investor. That means you had to have $1 million net worth, $200,000 plus in income. So doctors invest in real estate a lot of higher income professionals. Now through crowdfunding, just about anybody can. And so that was a change in 2015. So there's more opportunities for community investment in real estate. And I think supply, too, has to be part of the equation. There was a study out of San Francisco. State legislature there commissioned a study between 2000 and 2013. Low-income census tracts in the Bay Area that built the most market-rate housing experienced considerably less displacement. It's important, housing across the income spectrum. I think there's a tendency to see even higher income housing coming in as being a force of displacement. But low, medium, and high income housing is all part of the solution, because if we don't grow the pie, then the bidding for the remaining housing is going to get very strong, and it's going to cause the prices to rise and displacement to occur. And then, community land trusts, I think, are a great solution, providing more long-term affordable housing, low-income housing tax credits. The only word of caution there is, are you limiting people's ability to build wealth through housing? I think that's, it's kind of a double-edged sword, and so we got to think about that. And also, just from my national experience, I would say that this topic comes up everywhere, and yet the experience and the issues are so dramatically different. I've worked in Youngstown and Detroit. Gentrification comes up, and yet the housing markets there are in desperate need of investment. Desperate need of investment. New York City, DC, San Francisco is a totally different situation, and then places like Charlottesville kind of fall somewhere in the middle of that as well. So in closing, I'll just say thank you for having this conversation. I think it's important and a real honor to speak here, and I'm going to hand it off to Andrew.
Can you hear me? All right, well, thank you all for inviting me, and it's a real honor to be able to speak with you this afternoon. And I'm going to put some of the issues we've been discussing here, in particular some of the points that Tony raised in the first presentation, within a sort of historical context. It's kind of fitting, kind of following on a planner, having someone who does a little bit of planning history to talk about, in particular, the role that property taxes have played in shaping housing markets here in Charlottesville, and also kind of how we can sort of begin to understand the role that the property tax plays in urban finance. I think, certainly, policy matters here, but also the administration of policy matters, and sort of understanding the way that property taxes are administered, how property values are assessed, and the interests that sort of come to play is a critically important factor here. I mean, we know that the property tax has served as an agent of gentrification. As new residents, housing construction, commercial establishments enter into a neighborhood, property values increase, but so too do property taxes. Forcing many longtime residents, especially those on fixed incomes, to sell or run the risk of losing their property to tax foreclosure. Land speculators are well aware of the looming threat that homeowners face and are quick to take advantage of their predicament, either by pressuring people to sell or, in states that allow it, buying liens on tax delinquent property and exploiting homeowners for all they're worth through the various sort of vulnerabilities that they're experiencing. Local officials also know that rising property assessments can serve as a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, ensuring that a neighborhood will become too expensive for many of its current residents. Gentrifying neighborhoods in a sort of broad sense can be sort of characterized as almost having sort of two different housing markets. One for the sort of rehabbers and gentrifiers, and the other for longtime residents. This first market, is the gentrifying one, is where all the sales are happening, where properties are getting refurbished and resold at higher prices, where landlords can charge significantly higher rents. That second traditional market, on the other hand, is characterized by buildings that are maintained but perhaps not renovated, owner-occupied, with less frequent sales. Here, these are homes that have been oftentimes owned by families for years, where the market cannot bear higher rents. The problem is that in our system of assessments, we tend to treat these two markets as one, and in so doing, kind of turn them into one gentrifying housing market. That's because the method we use to recalculate assessments, property assessments, what's used to sort of figure out property taxes, is based on the sales and market data from the gentrifying market. Assessors use the sales data from gentrifying properties to calculate values for an entire area. And in effect, they're sort of shoehorning that second traditional market into the gentrifying one. The underlying problem, as I see it, is that the city's interest, and this is not just specific to Charlottesville, but to many cities, their interest in protecting and ensuring the availability of low-income housing is simply at odds with their fiscal needs and interests. Namely, their increased reliance on property taxes as a source of revenue. Since the 1970s, the amount of intergovernmental transfers from the federal and state level to cities has plummeted. This has placed more pressure on local governments to enhance the revenue-generating capacity of the property tax. redevelopment and gentrification are one of the most effective vehicles for achieving that goal. And it's not just through rising assessments do we begin to see some of these sort of interests that the city has at odds with their sort of duty to protect and serve their citizens. We also see this through the aggressive pursuit of uncollected fines and fees by cities, the introduction of new fees and service charges, or perhaps most infamously, the use of police forces as a generator of local revenue, as was revealed quite starkly in the Ferguson report done by the U.S. Justice Department. Since 1977, as the portion of intergovernmental transfers has declined, we've almost seen a sort of equal rise in the amount of revenue from charges and fees going into city coffers. Some cities have gotten, and I know many of you here who are from Chicago will be well familiar with this, some cities have gotten very creative in finding new sources of revenue. In 2014, the city of Chicago, which already had the shortest yellow lights for traffic signals in the nation at 3 seconds, decided to reduce the time their yellow lights flash by several fractions of a second. That slight change made a big difference. It resulted in 77,000 more tickets being issued that year, generating an estimated $8 million more in revenue.
Whoa.
Rahm Emanuel and all the other folks in City Hall were well aware of the difference that would make. So again, this is sort of where we begin to see, just one sort of example here among many, where we begin to see the sort of interest of cities in their fiscal needs increasingly sort of leading them into a kind of almost a predatory relationship with their own citizens. A subject that I've studied and written about a bit is one that's less applicable here, but in many other states, and especially in Illinois, is the use of tax lien sales. And this has been a real sort of driver of gentrification and property dispossession in many cities, where you have people who fall delinquent on their property taxes. Local governments, say Cook County, Illinois, will hold annual auctions where they sell these liens to investors who then can charge you interest on that debt. And if you do not settle within a 2-year period, they can take your property and all of its equity, literally for the cost of a single tax bill. This, again, is one of the sort of many ways in which the property tax has historically and continues to serve as one of the chief agents of property dispossession, in particular dispossession of African American owned property. And again, to sort of repeat, many of these techniques amount to basically targeted attacks on the poor. Those who can at least afford it, but also those who have the least amount of leverage. So again, as cities are increasingly looking to attract a certain sort of type of resident, employers, they increasingly sort of bend over backwards through tax cuts and through generous breaks, such as artificially low property assessments in certain neighborhoods, and then in turn sort of offload those costs onto those who have least amount of leverage. Now here to sort of bring it back to Charlottesville, I mean, one thing that's important to recognize about what Charlottesville's facing right now is that its reliance on property taxes is only sort of increasing and has sort of increased in the, during this time period. And it's one that leads it directly into the types of sort of strategies toward enhancing property values and also sort of displacing poor people over the last several decades. Because quite simply, Charlottesville cannot grow its way out of its own fiscal dilemma. By law, the city's boundaries are frozen per that 1982 agreement with Albemarle County, which helps explain why the city has, over these last several decades, aggressively pursued new sources of revenue internally and worked to enhance property tax receipts through high-end residential and commercial development. Another problem that we see here in Charlottesville, and this is again is something that's very specific to a university town, is the fact that so much of the sort of real estate here in Charlottesville is owned by the university and as a result is tax exempt. That includes parking lots, the entire medical complex, basketball arena. UVA owns a property here that is estimated, within the city, it's estimated at worth over $500 million that it pays no taxes on. The cost of those exemptions comes up to about $4.5 million each year. That's how much revenue the city is not getting through this tax-exempt property. And that keeps getting larger with each year. I mean, in 2016, UVA bought 2.63 acres, 7 properties next to the next to the hospital. Now, to be fair, UVA has, over the last several years, started paying a service charge to the city. But in 2010, that amounted to $33,000.
Oh, man.
About 1% of the sort of total sort of value that it had would otherwise be paying. Now, there are sort of, other cities that sort of face this same dilemma have tried strategies and have, in a sense, tried to put the screws on universities. To take one example, the city of Providence, Rhode Island, home to Brown University, has really stepped up its pressure on Brown University to enter into what are known as sort of pilot arrangements, payment in lieu of taxes, and has sort of forced them to sort of dramatically increase the amount of annual sort of payments that they're giving to the city because of the sort of way in which they have really, in some ways, kind of helped create the fiscal crisis that many cities face. This is not sort of, we've seen sort of limited progress on that front here locally. Just to give one example, I'll wrap up, is from a couple years ago when the city tried to get UVA to contribute financially to the massive sort of redesign project taking place along West Main. In response, Patrick Hogan, UVA's chief operating officer, balked at this sort of attempt by the city to get it to sort of contribute directly, arguing that UVA already contributed more than enough to the local economy to justify, again, sort of profiting from this sort of, this growth model. So again, I think, again, as a historian here, I'm sort of more sort of focused on kind of looking at sort of how we get into these problems, and particularly calling attention to the sort of larger context in which the local problems here are situated within. I will say, again, if we have time talking later about some of these solutions, including these pilot programs that some cities have adopted in relation to universities as being one possible sort of step toward addressing this fiscal crisis that ultimately then helps drive cities into these relationships where they are increasingly pushing poor people and increasingly trying to enhance property values beyond the capacity of residents to pay. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm a loud guy, so got 5 kids. I'm always yelling at them. So I am Harold Foley. I'm born and raised in Charlottesville. I lived in public housing all my youth and some of my adult life. And one of the biggest problems that we see a lot in public housing is not only the problem with affordable housing, but the problem with university not building housing for students. And so what happens is when you don't build housing for students, people who are or want to live in Charlottesville get priced out because students will pay any amount of money to live in Charlottesville, and the folks who live in Charlottesville who is either getting $7 an hour or less than $14 an hour cannot live in Charlottesville. So what happens is people who works at UVA are living 30 miles to 40 miles away from UVA. And I'm not talking about those folks who working in the offices or, the people who are writing policy. I'm talking about the folks who's claiming UVA. And I got this campaign to figure out what's colleges or universities in the United States has created workforce housing for folks who work at that college or university. With emphasis on helping them with buying homes. The problem we have in Charlottesville is we went into the share agreement with Albemarle County where Charlottesville wouldn't annex any land. And now Albemarle County wants to renege on that. But the reason why they want to renege on that is because they already developed all the way around where Charlottesville can take that land. So what we have now is we have a really funky thing that's going on with the county and UVA. But I agree with the folks on the panel. We need to come to the table, and we need to force both the county and UEA to come to the table. So the county doesn't really have low-income housing. The county doesn't really have subsidized housing. All of that is in Charlottesville. And you wonder why. It was planned like that, you know? And so what we have is we just have a lot of people who, I had a conversation with one of my colleague leaders, and she said that she had a conversation with a city council member, and the city council member said, black folks need to find an exit plan from Charlottesville.
Oh,
What did that mean?
direct. It's just direct.
That means that we need to do something to make black folks feel like they don't have to exit out of Charlottesville. That's what that means. And that means that we all need to fight together to make sure it doesn't happen. And you know, sometimes when the wind is blowing a pipe back and forth, a flag back and forth, that flag get raggedy and get messed up. But in the long term, that flag gonna be there forever. And what I find out that people sometimes get so depressed about the process that they want to give up. We have an opportunity now to kick some ass. And we got an opportunity because we got people from other places that want to help us. So this is the time to take on what we got to take on. So I'm not going to speak long because I want to hear questions that you have for them. So thank y'all. First of all, thank you FAR, thank you for Chicago, thank you for Nashville, thank you Atlanta, thank you for all the folks who came here to make this happen. Thank you.
So thank you to all of our panelists. Maybe before we open the floor, I'm wondering if any of the panelists would like to speak to any of the comments that we've heard. Any questions you all have for each other? Or
I
if-
like to say to what Andrew said, we see this, oh, sorry. I'd like to address what Andrew said. It's very true that when you see an area that's been gentrified, it looks as if the poverty disappeared or it got better, but it's actually been pushed out to the outskirts, so those numbers are no longer true. And then it ends up being where the people were pushed out to. It's a transportation desert, a food desert, and they're not making the wages to come back into the city and work and build it. So that's so true. I really resonate with what he said. So.
No, y'all got questions.
Andrew, I was hoping you could perhaps tell us a little more about the pilot fees. That's something I understand, for the city, gas utility. That's something that all customers pay. So that's people, that's residential customers in the city and county. And the university pays that too. But it seems like a transparency issue. A lot of people don't know they pay that. But I've heard city officials say, it's a way to get money out of the university.
Cut that water off.
But how is that equitable though? It ends up, it's not just the universities paying for that, it's city and county residents too. So I was wondering, is there a solution to, pass those costs on to the university without passing it on to residents, property owners, people that pay for, utility service?
Yeah, I don't think there's an easy solution to this mess we've gotten in, because there are, in some respects, there are good reasons for having certain properties tax exempt within a city. I think, the idea of sort of just simply removing tax exemptions in this respect is, could create a whole new host of problems. I will say though, again, it's the leverage here. The fact that, historically that we've seen the administration of property taxes operate in a way where power sort of speaks. And one of the sort of, especially at the local level, the power that, say, residents or employers have is the power to leave. And The one thing that universities don't have is the power to leave, and that's in a sense sort of what's many cities have recognized through these pilot programs is the fact that they are place-bound. Brown University is not going to up and move to Western Massachusetts. I mean, they're rooted in place, and so is UVA, of course. And so that is sort of recognizing one of the sort of points of leverage that local government might have and exacting concessions so that they are contributing not just sort of to in a direct one-to-one fashion, like we pay for what we get back in return, but also contributing to the sort of betterment of the entire community, which is ultimately what taxes should be doing, as opposed to just being a fee for service, which is kind of what they're increasingly becoming. I think again, I think the specifics of sort of how a pilot program similar to ones that we've seen in other cities would work here, I would perhaps maybe I'd defer to someone who'd have more expertise in tax policy here locally, but I would say that it is something to certainly be aware of, and it hasn't really been on the table, at least till now, from what I understand here in Charlottesville.
Yeah, I guess my question is in regards to the conversation about using tax schemes and various fee collections as, being used as a weapon of class warfare, more or less. And what I'm curious about is, especially apropos of the conversation about Dillon Rule and what that means for housing activism, have there been any historical examples of that, like turning that weapon around and using taxation and revenue generation schemes as a way to incentivize or prop up extremely low income housing situations?
Well, there's certainly protections that can be put in place. I mean, whether they be circuit breakers, whether they're other mechanisms to ensure that, and this is something I maybe let Tony speak to this, because he also mentioned that, finding strategies that will ensure that low-income residents of neighborhoods do not continue to see their property assessments increase as you see housing values surrounding them do so. So I think maybe some of the strategies that they're using could be particularly helpful in this situation.
Yeah, actually, that was sort of my question is, since you've really given us the history of the function of property taxes to, to displaced people, and your, both for Kenitha and Tony, a key principle is permanence and keeping those property taxes low. Could you say again some of the strategies that you all have found useful in keeping property taxes low?
Okay, well, one thing that I think is really important is you hear the city developers, they have plans, and they're developing plans probably 10 years out. So even when they want to have a meeting, they're coming to the community saying, we have this plan, what's your opinion of it, right? So one thing we should all recognize is when we say vision, part of that vision means we got to come together and say not only what our vision is long term, but what do y'all want to see Charlottesville to look like in 10 years? Don't tell me where it is now. Don't tell me where it is now. Because what happens when you start now, it's like in the 60s when there was segregation, people said, okay, we're dealing with segregation, right? Don't question, that's just too hard to change. Let's talk about what we're going to do within that, right? We're in the same thing with housing, right? So let's not just talk about what we can't do. What do you want to see in 10 years? I'll tell you, Homes for All, we're starting to do that. It took us 5 years at Homes for All to get to a place where all the leadership, Kenitha, folks from all the 39 cities get together after 5 years, and we can actually say, listen, just sharing and learning from each other ain't enough. Let's look 10 years out. What do we want? You know what everyone said? People said, one, we want universal rent control in the United States. And then people said, instead of saying, oh, we can't win that, we said, okay, hold on. What would it take to win that? People said, well, we would have a national tenant union. We would have 2 million tenants of the 23 million that have unaffordable rent. We would have 10% organized in this tenant union. There would be tenant unions in every city. So, and then we asked people, well, if we really organize tenants to that level, could we win universal rent control? Yeah. Then let's talk about how we do that, right? So I would challenge y'all, next time we come to Charlottesville, y'all need to have your 10-year plan. right? And when they say, hey, we're starting from this place, say, excuse me, we have our own plan, right? And in this question you're asking, revenue, where do we get the money? What about the taxes? Well, part of your plan is the alternative solution to that, right? So the reality is in this country, the ideal alternative solution doesn't exist in many places, right? The revenue's out there. When you go, the revenue needs to come from the speculators and the people who are profiteering and stealing off the backs of people, right? Speculation taxes, right? If you look at Rise of the Renter Nation, you'll see a bunch of ideas. Every time someone sells a property, you can tax that, right? Financial transaction taxes, vacancy taxes, right? I mean, the people who are profiting tremendously off of land and housing here, tax them in a bunch of different ways. You would have revenue, right? Now, what's happened in many cities is they've created housing trust funds because they found ways to get millions of dollars. They put it in a housing trust fund, and then they dictate, hey, the housing trust fund can only be used to create housing 0 to 30%, ideally, and it has to be on community control, on community land trusts, right? We have to dream before we're gonna win that, right? And then once you dream, the next thing is you're gonna realize you have to organize, right? Because what you wanna win, they're not gonna agree to. Because what you wanna win is gonna mean less profit for the developers. It's gonna mean less money for UVA, right? But part of your plan would be, hey, UVA, this is how you fit into the plan. You own this much land, 40% of your land, you hand over to community land trust. Just hand it over for free, number one, right? Number two, why don't you open your doors so that your population is 20% black students, right? From Virginia, right? I mean, you start putting demands out. What's wrong? Fix it. The same reason they're taking land and screwing y'all over is the same white supremacy why very few black folk from Virginia are at UVA, right? So I think the biggest thing is where's the vision, where's the plan, where are the demands? And start from that point. Granted, when you fight, you may not win all that. But if you never name where you're going, you'll never get there, right? So I think that's the biggest contradiction I'd like to lift up.
All right.
Do we want to hear from I think we have time for one more question, if there is one.
Hi. So I'm a student at the university, and I currently am a renter. And so I'm curious, especially to what you were saying, and I'd be curious to hear, what Kenitha and the Charlottesville people have to say, since I know Nashville also has so many universities that are playing a huge role in this, and just how you get, student tenant support, right? How do you get students involved in this process, especially because students don't have this long-term vision for a community, right? We're only here for 4 years on average. And so, and I think something that's factoring into my thinking about it is I live on 14th Street, which is pretty much monopolized by the CBS, renters, whatever business. And I know that my lease right now, the people who are living in my house are all living in it illegally because we have way more people in it in order to make it more affordable for us.